Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is December 18th, and we're looking back 160 years to December 18th, 1865, when Georgia became the 27th state to ratify the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, providing the three-quarters majority needed to make it law. With Georgia's vote, the amendment became official. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Here's what fascinates me about this moment. The Civil War had ended 8 months earlier in April 1865. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was functionally dead in most of the South. Yet it took until December for the Constitution to formally abolish slavery nationwide. And even then, the amendment contained a crucial exception that still shapes American justice today. That exception, except as a punishment for crime, would create a loophole that Southern states would exploit almost immediately, using convict leasing and prison labor to recreate many aspects of slavery under a different name. The 13th Amendment was simultaneously one of America's greatest achievements and the beginning of a new system of racial oppression. So, how did we get to December 18th, 1865? What did the 13th Amendment actually accomplish? And why does its exception clause still matter 160 years later? Let's explore this pivotal moment and discover how it continues to shape our world today. To understand the 13th Amendment, we need to know that the Civil War didn't start as a war to end slavery. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, President Abraham Lincoln's stated goal was to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. He wrote to Horace Greeley in 1862, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." Lincoln personally opposed slavery, but he also believed he lacked constitutional authority to abolish it in states where it already existed. The Constitution protected slavery. It's mentioned in several provisions, though the word slavery never appears. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The Fugitive Slave Clause required the return of escaped slaves. The Constitution protected the slave trade until at least 1808. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1st, 1863, was a war measure. Lincoln justified it as necessary to weaken the Confederacy. It freed enslaved people only in rebellious states, not in border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri that remained in the Union. It was a military order, not a law, and could be challenged in courts once the war ended. Here's what strikes me about this legal complexity. Even as the Union was winning a war that killed 600,000 Americans, slavery's constitutional status remained uncertain. Lincoln understood that permanent abolition required a constitutional amendment. Lincoln made passing the 13th Amendment a priority for his second term, but first it had to pass Congress. The Senate passed it 38-6 on April 8, 1864. The House was the problem. On June 15, 1864, the House voted 93 to 65 in favor, short of the two-thirds majority needed for a constitutional amendment. The vote fell along party lines. Republicans supported it, Democrats opposed it. Lincoln made the amendment central to his 1864 re-election campaign. After winning decisively, he had political capital, but he needed to convince enough Democrats to change their votes. What followed was one of the most intense lobbying efforts in congressional history. Lincoln and his allies used every tool available: promises of patronage jobs, hints about future positions, negotiations over other legislation, and direct appeals to conscience and legacy. Some historians suggest money may have changed hands, though evidence is circumstantial. The movie Lincoln depicts this process: the backroom deals, the arm-twisting, the moral appeals mixed with raw politics. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. On January 31, 1865, the House voted again, 119 to 56, one vote more than the two-thirds majority needed. The gallery erupted in celebration. Members wept. The chamber was so loud that Speaker Schuyler E. Colfax had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. I always wonder what those final persuaded Democrats thought in that moment. Did they genuinely change their minds about slavery? Or did they simply calculate that supporting abolition was politically safer than opposing it in a one war? Does motivation matter if the outcome is just? Lincoln signed the resolution, though constitutionally unnecessary for amendments, and sent it to the states for ratification. He would not live to see ratification completed. John Wilkes Booth assassinated him on April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The amendment needed 3/4 of states to ratify, 27 of the 36 states in 1865. Some states ratified quickly. Illinois, Lincoln's home state, was first on February 1, 1865. By February, 15 states had ratified. But then progress slowed. The war was ending, Lincoln was dead, and Southern states were returning to the Union with legislatures controlled by former Confederates. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, pursued lenient Reconstruction policies. He allowed Southern states to form new governments quickly, often controlled by the same people who led the Confederacy. These governments were required to ratify the 13th Amendment as a condition of readmission to the Union, but they could negotiate. Here's where the "except as a punishment for crime" clause became crucial. Some historians argue that this exception was explicitly included to make ratification more palatable to Southern states. Others note it was standard language that had appeared in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Regardless of intent, the effect was clear. States could still use forced labor through the criminal justice system. Georgia ratified on December 6, 1865. Oregon followed on December 8th. With 26 states having ratified, one more was needed. Iowa ratified on December 15th, but confusion arose over whether its ratification was valid due to procedural issues. On December 18, 1865, Georgia's ratification was officially certified. It may have happened earlier, but was certified on this date, providing the 27th ratification and making the amendment law. Secretary of State William Seward formally proclaimed the 13th Amendment part of the Constitution. After 246 years of slavery on North American soil, it was finally abolished by law. Now we need to talk about those 8 words: except as a punishment for crime. Almost immediately after the 13th Amendment's ratification, Southern states began passing black codes. laws specifically targeting formerly enslaved people. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed. Apprenticeship laws allowed courts to force black children into unpaid labor. Loitering laws, laws against insulting gestures, laws against violating labor contracts, all designed to give police reasons to arrest black people. Once arrested and convicted, these individuals could be leased to private companies as convict labor. This convict leasing system was slavery by another name. People working under armed guard, often in the same fields they'd worked as slaves, sometimes for the same landowners. Douglas Blackmon's book, Slavery by Another Name, documents this system extensively. Companies would pay the state for convict labor. Prisoners worked in mines, built railroads, picked cotton, cut timber, under conditions often worse than slavery, because, unlike slaves who were property, convict laborers were disposable. If one died, the company just leased another. This wasn't a brief transition period. Convict leasing continued well into the 20th century. Alabama didn't end it until 1928. Some forms persisted even longer. Here's what troubles me as someone who values evidence-based understanding. Did the framers of the 13th Amendment anticipate this? Did they knowingly create a loophole, or was it an unintended consequence? The evidence suggests both. Some abolitionists objected to the exception clause during debates. Others saw it as a necessary compromise language that seemed minor compared to ending chattel slavery. But intent matters less than effect. The exception clause provided legal justification for a new system of forced labor targeting black Americans specifically. That exception clause, except as punishment for crime, still exists in the 13th Amendment today. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, about 2 million people in prisons and jails. While black Americans comprise about 13% of the U.S. population, they make up nearly 40% of the prison population. Prisoners work for pennies per hour or nothing at all. They manufacture goods, fight wildfires, work in call centers, perform agricultural labor, do laundry, cook food. Private companies contract with prisons for labor. States save money by using prison workers instead of paid employees. Legally, this is constitutional because of the 13th Amendment's exception clause. Courts have consistently ruled that prisoners can be forced to work, that they have no right to minimum wage, that their labor conditions don't violate the amendment. Several states have recently moved to remove the exception clause from their state constitutions. In 2022, voters in Louisiana, Tennessee, Oregon, and Vermont voted on ballot measures to eliminate slavery exceptions from their state constitutions. Tennessee, Oregon, and Vermont passed these measures. Louisiana's failed, partly due to confusing ballot language. This isn't about whether prisoners should work. Many argue work provides skills, structure, and purpose. It's about whether forced unpaid labor, justified by the same constitutional clause used to create convict leasing after the Civil War, continues patterns of racial injustice. Before we focus entirely on the exception clause, we need to acknowledge what the 13th Amendment accomplished. It ended chattel slavery, the system where human beings were property that could be bought, sold, inherited, and used as collateral for loans. It freed 4 million people from bondage. It fundamentally transformed American society and began the process of making the promises of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, apply to black Americans. The 13th Amendment was followed by the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. These Reconstruction amendments fundamentally changed the Constitution from a document that protected slavery to one that promised equality. The amendment gave Congress power to enforce abolition through appropriate legislation. This enforcement clause became the basis for civil rights laws in the 1860s and, a century later, for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without the 13th Amendment, none of this progress would have been possible. But, and this is crucial, ending slavery didn't end racial oppression. New systems emerged almost immediately. Black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping that created debt peonage, Jim Crow segregation, lynching, voter suppression. The 13th Amendment was necessary, but not sufficient. It eliminated one system of racial oppression while containing the seeds for another. So why does December 18, 1865 matter today, 160 years later? First, the 13th Amendment reminds us that formal legal equality and actual equality are different things. Slavery was abolished, but racial injustice continued through other systems. Jim Crow segregation lasted nearly a century after the abolition of slavery. Mass incarceration has created new forms of racial disparity. Legal changes are crucial. You can't have justice without just laws. But laws alone don't create justice. The structures, practices, and attitudes that perpetuate inequality require ongoing effort to dismantle. Second, the exception clause demonstrates how well-intentioned reforms can contain loopholes that undermine their purpose. Did abolitionists who fought for the 13th Amendment imagine convict leasing? Probably not most of them. But by including the exception language, whether as a compromise or oversight, they created the constitutional justification for a new form of forced labor. This matters for contemporary policy debates. When we pass reforms, are we checking for loopholes? Are we considering how they might be exploited? Good intentions don't prevent unintended consequences if we're not rigorous about implementation. Third, the 13th Amendment's history shows that progress is neither linear nor permanent. Slavery was abolished, yet convict leasing recreated many of its worst aspects. Jim Crow segregation was defeated, yet mass incarceration creates new forms of racial inequality. The 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights, yet voter suppression continues. Each generation must defend and extend the gains previous generations won. Rights once won are not automatically preserved. Here's what December 18, 1865 teaches us about justice, reform, and unfinished work. First, transformative change is possible even after catastrophic conflict. The Civil War killed 2% of the American population, equivalent to about 7 million deaths today. The nation was shattered, yet in that moment of devastation, Americans amended their Constitution to end an institution that had existed for centuries. This offers hope. Even after terrible division and violence, fundamental reform is achievable, but it requires political will, moral clarity, and strategic action. Second, the details matter enormously. 8 words, except as a punishment for crime, created a loophole that enabled a century of convict leasing and provides constitutional justification for prison labor today. When drafting laws and policies, we must attend carefully to language, anticipate how it might be exploited, and remain vigilant about implementation. Third, abolishing an unjust system doesn't automatically create a just one in its place. Slavery was abolished, but new systems of racial oppression emerged. This pattern recurs throughout history. Old injustices replaced by new ones unless deliberate effort creates better alternatives. Negative reforms, ending what's wrong, must be accompanied by positive reforms, building what's right. Fourth, the work of justice is never finished. The 13th Amendment was a crucial step, not a final destination. It took another century to dismantle Jim Crow. The work of creating true equality continues today. Every generation inherits both achievements to defend and injustices to address. The question isn't whether the work is done, it never is, but whether we're doing our part. On December 18, 1865, Georgia's ratification made the 13th Amendment law, formally abolishing slavery in the United States after 246 years. 4 million people who'd been property became free. The Constitution, which had protected slavery, was amended to prohibit it. It was one of America's greatest achievements and the beginning of new struggles. The philosopher George Santayana wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The 13th Amendment's history teaches us to remember complexity, the triumph of abolition and the loophole that enabled convict leasing, the achievement of formal equality, and the persistence of racial injustice through new systems. Remembering means recognizing that the 13th Amendment didn't end America's racial struggle. It changed its terms. From slavery to convict leasing to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, each system was distinct yet connected, each exploiting loopholes in law and gaps between legal equality and actual justice. This isn't about guilt or blame for what happened 160 years ago. It's about understanding how patterns persist across time, how unfinished work from one generation becomes the burden of the next, and how justice requires constant vigilance. The 13th Amendment's exception clause remains in the Constitution. The United States still has the highest incarceration rate in the world. The question isn't whether the framers of the 13th Amendment were good or bad people. It's what we choose to do with the system we've inherited. We can celebrate the achievement of abolition while working to close the remaining loopholes. We can honor those who fought to end slavery while continuing their unfinished work toward justice. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and choosing where we go next. The 13th Amendment gave us tools for that work. Whether we use them is up to us. That's why we remember. Thanks for joining me today on the Daily History Chronicle. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with someone who loves history. Tomorrow, we'll explore another fascinating moment from our shared past. Until then, I'm Richard Backus, reminding you that history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to do with that knowledge.